giant robot smashing into other giant robots.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Giant Robots Smashing into Other Giant Robots podcast, where we explore the design, development, and business of great products. A really special one for you today, and one that I've been really looking forward to, because I know that in the software industry, we are slightly drained by the constant talk of AI, and it feels like the limelight has been on us for long enough now. So I'm excited today because I'm joined by Joe Cohen, a legal innovation partner at Harvey, an AI platform designed for legal and professional services. So we're going to be talking about AI in a different context for once. Joe, welcome to the podcast. How do I find you on this wonderful morning?
Very good. Thanks, Sami. Yeah, all good. Looking forward to our chat.
Really cool. So again, like a lot of our listeners kind of sit in the software industry. We're a consultancy which works on software products, development, design, delivery. But there is a whole different world where AI is kind of starting to creep into. I feel like software was kind of at the frontier, and maybe that's because of there's little regulation, and maybe it was an easier place to start. But can you tell us a little bit more about Harvey? What you're trying to do in the legal space, maybe what the problem is that it sees and how it's trying to provide the solution.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if I go back maybe 10 years or so, that was kind of the first iteration of AI for legal. And I think the premise, like the high level promises have kind of remained the same, right? It's about trying to make lawyers more efficient in the way that they deliver legal work to clients. So whether that's reviewing contracts more quickly, drafting agreements, doing legal research, kind of case strategy and brainstorming. Then on the litigation side, doing chronologies, summarizations. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there are loads of different use cases, the way that lawyers kind of interact with the platform and the agents in it. But, so I think the industry has been on a bit of a transformation journey over the course of the last, probably since about, I think 2016 was when you saw some law firms build nascent innovation teams. And I was on one of the first ones of those at Linklaters back then. And, you did have some legal AI platforms. But I think like ultimately, at that point, the technology wasn't there, and it was, it was exciting in one way, but a bit of a hard sell in other ways. And that I would say probably continued until generative AI came about, and that's roughly the same time that Harvey started. Harvey actually started a little bit before then, because they were working in partnership with OpenAI, so they had a little bit of a head start on the public release of ChatGPT. But what that meant was they had a really fantastic product, and within the first, within the first year, probably even within the first 6 months of launching, signed partnerships with two of the biggest organisations. One of them was Allen and Overy, one of the Magic Circle law firms in the UK. One of them was PwC. So, really hot start for the company. I suppose it's kind of only grown since then. But yeah, I mean, like at a high level, we are a platform that significantly enhances the efficiency and quality and speed of lawyers doing legal work.
Yeah, so I mean, like the growth that you kind of mentioned there has been pretty astronomical for a company that started only in 2022 to now becoming like a household name. It sounds like you got some big clients early on, and that's definitely helped you. I know when I speak to people, a lot of people know and have heard of Harvey AI already. Can you just let's imagine, I just want to try and get into a little bit of the details about it. Imagine I have a law firm and there's absolutely no AI involved in what we're doing.
Yeah.
What does it look like on my first day or onboarding me to using Harvey AI? What changes?
Well, so I mean, I'll probably just answer that by talking a little bit about my background. So I've joined Harvey from the law firm innovation side. So I was the head of innovation at a law firm called Dentons, the UK Ireland Middle East branch of Dentons, for about 5 years. Then I was the innovation director at another law firm called Charles Russell Speechlys, running like the generative AI team, the legal project management team, and the software dev team, and a few other bits and pieces.
So is your background tech or law? I can't really make this out.
So, well, most people in those innovation director roles were former lawyers, apart from me.
Okay.
So what is my background? I mean, I didn't do a law degree, I did an economics degree. And then I was a tech consultant for Deloitte for a number of years after university. And then since then I've just joined the legal industry in different innovation roles.
Okay.
So yeah, anyway, so I mean, so I've actually rolled out Gen AI platforms at 2 law firms personally. So I've overseen those rollouts. So I can tell you basically how it looks. So, because you might think, lawyers, quite traditional, have been working in fairly similar ways for the last, 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
There have been other technological revolutions in that time, like the word processor, email, e-discovery systems, legal research platforms. But I mean, like the actual way in which legal work was delivered hasn't massively changed over that time. So you might think that actually it's a bit of a hard push to roll out one of these platforms. But in my experience, and also now having been involved in it on the Harvey side over lots and lots of rollouts now since I joined the company, we get up to like 85% adoption across entire firms over the first 6 months. And that is because it's not just that the platform is intuitive or whatever, but it is so meaningful to lawyers. I mean, you have to remember these are large language models, and law is the profession of the language essentially.
Yeah.
So actually, we've had great engagement from lawyers, and you might have. I mean, some of your listeners may not be too familiar with the legal industry, but and they probably won't mind me saying this. Charles Russell Speechlys are known to be one of the more conservative firms, right? But we had fantastic level of adoption, of engagement, of enthusiasm from the partners there, and I mean that's only shown me that it can be done anywhere. But I think the point really is that Gen AI in law is extremely meaningful and extremely relevant to those legal professionals, and that is partly why we have amassed so many clients and a big valuation that's allowed us to scale over the last few years.
Yeah, it's so interesting because in the software industry, it's kind of like a mixed bag. Like you do have people who are, you've probably come across terms like vibe coding, or at least AI assisted coding. There's people who are like all in on it and like this is the future, this is where we are. Then you kind of have people who are absolutely against it. They sometimes come from a climate change perspective, or they just come from a craftsmanship perspective. And you have some people who kind of sit in the middle as skeptics. Do you said like adoption has been quite high. Like, why do you think that is so successful? Because I feel like in the software industry, it hasn't. A lot of people are taking it on, but at least I'll speak from a perspective of a developer. Like there are certain, there's grumblings in certain industries, like we're being measured by lines of code or token usage and things like that. And so it hasn't been as smooth.
Okay, so how are law firms measuring their usage of the platform? And there are a few different ways which we encourage clients to do that. So law has always been like with any other service, you're trying to figure out what's the value been to your client. But actually, that's usually quite difficult with legal services. They obviously are very valuable and they are necessary in many different ways. But what's the actual value that you are creating for your client has always been hard to measure. So the proxy for that value has always been time, right? Time, the longer a piece of legal work took, we assume that the more valuable, it has been for the client, which I think has always been Not it's the most practical way of doing it, and it's also the most consistent, I suppose. And that's why you talk about the billable hour, and you think about different ways of pricing your inputs. So as a lawyer, you're inputting your time and energy into a piece of work. That could be a huge transaction, or rather like a long multi-year litigation, or that could be a short piece of work. But actually, the value that you deliver has never been like well defined. Sometimes it is. Sometimes on litigation, for example, when some a company's doing another company, in the end, there's an award, like a financial award. And so you might say, oh, well, we've been working on this for 3 years. The value is just the value of what the settlement is. So yeah, the problem now is that the link between that time and value is breaking.
Yeah,
and you can deliver an extraordinarily large amount of value in a really short period of time. Now, in theory, you could have done that before as well. Let the partner goes on. The partner answers a really difficult question. That has extremely valuable to a client's litigation or whatever, or planned purchase of another company. Using their judgment that they've accrued over 30 years. But I think, generally speaking, that link between the longer I now give my time to a particular piece of legal work, the more valuable it is breaking. And so we're encouraging clients to do 2 things. The first is to measure the impact of AI on a particular type of legal work. So that might be like a specific type of deal, or it could be like, negotiating a construction agreement, like to that level of detail, and saying, before implementing Harvey, how long did it take you? What kind of people, what kind of seniorities do you have working on the file? How long were they doing it for? How much of that billable time was actually end up being recovered, and things like that? And then do that again, and like, what were the margins, the profit margins on that, on average? On that type of work, and then now what's it like after Harvey, and that will obviously change over time as like the maturity of the adoption of AI grows, because typically we see people start with like the chat features, and they are very accurate and effective, but like start with a chat, let's say move on to like reviewing hundreds of documents for 10 or 20, 30 different columns, different things. So that, is also very valuable. But then moving from that to a workflow or to an agent that will do a whole task end to end, integrating different platforms by itself. So, supervised by the lawyer, but, essentially but by depth of maturity, we mean what scope of task and how long can it work on a particular task. So, and as you get more mature with your use of AI, you'll see the financial impact to matters change. So you will always know, before Harvey, this was like the financial aspect of it. And, after we implemented Harvey, it's this. And then a year later, it changed again. So I think having a fine grasp on that, because otherwise you can't, it's useful business information, right? I think people think about AI as this shiny thing, and, adoption's really high, and that means we've cracked it and we've transformed ourselves and whatever. But actually, ultimately you have to keep a strong eye on how it's impacting the business. So, and if you're not looking at in that specific level, you just won't know. And once you do have that information, you're tracking it, let's say month on month, you can start to make proper business decisions on how you price work, what kind of work you even offer in the first place, to who is your competition, where are we going as a company. So this, I'd say, is proper strategy. This is proper, because over the years you look at how law firms have grown. Yeah, some of them have said, right, we're going to start to play in a new area, but actually usually growth is fairly linear. Not in all cases, obviously. One partner of a law firm said to me the other day that, historically he would say law firms have not been involved in strategy, they've been involved in stewardship, which I thought was actually, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but it was quite an interesting take on now that transformation is coming thick and fast, and the data that you can get to really influence where the business is going is there if you look for it. I mean, certainly this is like, real strategy. But, ultimately that is still looking at the way in which legal work has always been delivered, which is like how much time, you're putting into things. And now that you can do legal work more quickly, how does that impact the way that input-based mechanisms, whether, it's billing by the hour or it's fixed stuff, or whether it's other alternative capped fees, alternative arrangements. But now you can start to look at the outputs. You can look at, what the way that I like to think of it is the speed that you can operate at. So, you're a law firm and you have invested time and money in being more efficient. And like, that you've measured it, you can do a particular piece of legal work faster. So that speed that you've now enabled, potentially over and above what your competitors have done, can you tie that to like dollar value to your clients? That, for me, that's the interesting bit. Is like, can you talk about value, and value, like how valuable is this contract or this piece of litigation or whatever to a particular client? I mean, it's valuable, but like you can't really say how much or whatever. But what you can do is you can say, our speed has unlocked this very specific piece of value for you because we've done this bit quicker, which means you can lock in a better rate or you can realize more revenue and we can measure it. For me, that's one of the key bits for generative AI for the next few years.
Yeah, I think it's a problem every industry is facing. Like everyone who's in the time and materials business, which is where software developers, a lot of them sit, especially if they're working in a consultancy role. Accountants work a lot on time and materials, as do lawyers. It's like a big moment of rethinking how do we provide value. And how do we measure that value? As you said, like the metrics that we've been using, which is time, perhaps isn't the best metric. So you spoke about speed as well, and this is one of the questions we face. Like, how do you ensure that with speed, quality is maintained? Because I reckon a lot of, especially in law, and I know we have this in software, like there's high risk consequences to if something goes wrong, and so there's a concern which I don't think is, it's not only about AI, it's about all kind of processes and practices across the business. But with AI, you have a lot more speed, a lot more volume. Things happen quicker than you can possibly track them. So are there ways of ensuring quality and especially in law, kind of compliance and responsibility?
Yeah. So you've touched on an interesting sub point, which is, so I mentioned before, like, the partner of 30 years walks into the room and they are in a position where they have that judgment and they've gained that judgment through experience, 20, 30 years of doing deals, seeing things happen, consequences of decisions, whatever. So in a world where judgment is gained by experience, but junior lawyers are missing out on that experience and repetitions because AI is doing more heavy lifting. What will the partners in 10, 15 years actually look like? What will they know is a very live problem for the industry.
Yeah, agreed.
But on the flip side, I think there is like a very significant potential for AI itself to be the tutor and the coach and the tester and the supervisor. I mean, look, if you are happy with, let's say, AI generating the material for a particular clause or, an agreement for a particular deal, then you should also be comfortable with it generating a set of questions and guidance notes and kind of like coaching, quizzing material for that lawyer, after it's generated that, so that they can learn in like very specific ways all the time at 2:00 in the morning or whatever, like, or it's just kind of always there. And that doesn't negate the need for their human supervisor, the senior associate. Right. But like it definitely is important. And the always on nature of it, and like, the ideal would be the supervisor is kind of always there for the associate, but that's not the case. So what can technology do to almost solve the problem that it created by its own existence? Is something that we're looking closely at, because obviously, the reason I mention that is the partner using AI is very powerful, because in most cases they can just look at the outputs and say, like, yeah, that's right, or like, hold on a second, I'm not right about that. It's missed something. But like, obviously the junior associate can't do that because they don't have any experience. So you've got that issue. And I do actually think that if we do that bit properly, juniors will become seniors more quickly. Like, we can probably imbue that judgment more quickly now if we do this properly than we could do before through what was essentially the like master apprentice program of training by osmosis and just kind of sitting in the room and listening to what was going on. I mean, like, who knows? But like, what I can tell you is, if we do nothing, then the trainees now, the junior associates now, in 10 years, will not have the requisite level of experience that partners do today. So yeah, I think on the more mundane side, training lawyers how to actually critically verify AI generated outputs, like what to look for, having like a proper framework to like for each bit of AI generated content, and that might be like a long report on like many contracts. It's not like just one paragraph. It could be really involved, lots of citations, and like that review may take a while. But also it depends on like the risk level, at least in my view. Like, I don't think you can have a one size fits all verification process. Like, if it's like something for an internal summary, like, not spend hours reviewing it. It's about the risk. If it's going to the court, make sure that you followed the whole thing, and then you've also explained it all to the senior associate and then the partner, or whatever the process is. Like, it's got to be horses for courses in some way.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing the same thing. So there's a real concern about junior developers coming in to kind of the software business or the software industry, and how do they get up to speed and how do they gain that experience? And I think like that part is really interesting to me about, can you use AI to level up humans? I've been learning this week a new programming language and a new framework, and I've literally used Claude as my personal tutor, and it's been unbelievable. It sat with me through everything. It knows the traps I keep falling into, like the conceptual models that I keep making mistakes on, and it knows the bits that I do know. And so any new information, it kind of ties into, or it uses the bits that I do know as a frame of reference. So you already know X works like this. This is how Y then fits into that model. So as a personal tutor, it's pretty incredible. But then what I'm understanding is, and maybe this is kind of one of the critical questions that people worry about, is you're not looking at something like Harvey AI or AI agent to actually replace lawyers.
Not to replace lawyers. No, I don't think we're saying that we're going to be replacing lawyers. I think we're saying that they're going to do more enjoyable work, more high value work. I also think that there's a piece around. Okay, I mean, like, let's look at the industry more broadly, right? And I think it's not just lawyers using AI. The bankers using it, the accountants using it, the deal teams. Everyone's using it a different way. And I think, like, if we look at the demand for legal services down the years, like, think about the word processor, which replaced the typewriter, which replaced obviously the written contracts. But even with the typewriter, in order to negotiate a contract, you would need to like rewrite the whole page, or potentially the whole contract if they would like that a change there impacted other bits of the document. And that just like practically led to like quite short contracts that took ages to type, and then you had to like post them. So like really friction-led process. So the word processor comes in, And people are like, oh, we don't even need lawyers anymore because we like now that process, we've removed a whole bunch of friction, and we can have template contracts and like in-house lawyers or even non-lawyers can just use them, and like we don't need lawyers anymore. That was literally in the 80s. That was the language. But actually, all it meant was once that friction got removed, contracts were able to be a lot longer because you could do them quicker. Clients got more demanding as to like what they actually wanted to be in a contract. So they got longer, got more relevant to clients. Client demanded a lot more contracts, which also led to like more litigation as contracts got more specific, for example. And actually that decade, I think there ended up being 76% more lawyers over the course of the decade. And there'll be like different reasons to that, but certainly not the death of the lawyer or anything like it. That look at email. Email comes in, and actually the Law Society at the time was saying that it's going to bring the legal profession into disrepute. Law firms did not want to adopt email at the time.
Interesting. Okay.
Huge controversy about email. And in the end, all it did was mean that you could converse a lot quicker with other parties. And so deals will get done a lot quicker. Like you're just removing waiting time, and you're, just making everything, you're greasing the wheel significantly. And I think my personal view is we will just see deal cycles again shrink because, you can do the legal work, the banking work, the consulting. You can do everything that constitutes a deal, a purchase or merger or whatever. You will just see more of them. I think you'll just see more, and that just means more legal work ultimately. And I think we are seeing what you might characterize as demand expansion already in the market. I think we're already seeing it as work is done more quickly due to AI, whether that's law firms using it, whether that's in-house teams using it, whether that's non-lawyers using, ChatGPT for some level of legal documentation or whatever. I think we're already seeing this piece around faster work leading to more work. Just like, you do a piece of work faster, something else replaces it. And I just think that's human nature. Like, I have not met a in-house lawyer yet. I literally have not met any that tell me they are less busy because of AI. Not one. They are all more busy because, more productive and more things come up and you can do more to, it unlocks problems that you couldn't even face. Like for me, like the way I'm not a lawyer, so, I'm not using Harvey to do, produce legal documentation. But I use it for other things and, a few other platforms alongside and whatever. I'm probably like a ridiculous factor more efficient because there are things that I can do now using AI that I wouldn't offer otherwise. I just would not offer this kind of service to clients if I didn't have that means of production at my fingertips. And I think lawyers are kind of the same. But like, am I any less busy? Of course not. Of course I'm not. So yeah, I think it's like, going back to the question about replacing lawyers. I think we will see. I mean, ultimately, generative AI is a supply, what you might in economic terms call a supply side expansion. So lawyers are more efficient; they can provide more of their services. And I think we're seeing not just a equivalent expansion in demand as like supply goes up and price goes down. You're actually seeing potentially a disproportionate level of increase in demand. I'll give you another example and then I'll stop talking. But like, if you're on a deal, you're a lawyer on a deal, and you instead of like reviewing a bunch of contracts, like 5 or 10 things, you review all of the contracts that you were given, not just like the biggest ones. You review all of them for like 20 or 30 different things from a legal perspective. And if you do that, then you will find more risks, more things to flag to the client that you weren't looking for before. And some of them will be of interest. And the client will tell you, that's interesting in this like, more remote jurisdiction for this deal. We weren't looking at it. But now that you found it, we need to do a deeper dive into that. And that is a new piece of work that never would have come about before.
Yeah.
Actually, there's this piece around like AI enables more work through its own efficiency, which is also quite interesting. So anyway, there's a whole mix there, and I think it's definitely not as simple as we're replacing lawyers because at first I didn't happen on you.
No, I found that as well, which is cool because I've tried to say to AI on kind of like small things where I've got arguments with, let's say, car insurance or parking tickets. I've kind of said to ChatGPT or Claude, you are my lawyer who has never lost a case before. You are direct and sometimes often aggressive. Please write me a letter, that a lawyer would write to kind of defend me. And sometimes it's helped me and sometimes it hasn't. But it started to open the door for me, like, okay, this is where a lawyer would be helpful. This is where my limitations are.
Yeah.
And so it opens me up to the opportunity of, if I do need to take this a step further, this is what kind of where I would go. So it's like an enabler, but it also then directs you more to kind of towards the experts as well.
Yeah. So, there is this concept of unmet legal needs, which normally refers to like civilians or sole traders who have legal problems that they either don't know that they've got or can't solve because they can't afford the right services. And I don't know what the future will hold, but what I will tell you is that number, which is tracked by like public institutions, is going to have to drop significantly before I can be persuaded that, the legal industry is in danger, for example. It's like millions of people every year have an unmet legal need. It's like only growing.
Yeah.
Like, backlog in the courts is only getting worse. And, so I think, let's not focus on the end of lawyers. That's the wrong side of the discussion. Let's focus on, or at least on the public facing side, like reducing the unmet legal need, reducing the backlog, fairer justice, more consistent justice. Like there's so much on the other side of the equation.
Yeah. And I love that angle. I think that's a very opportunistic and hopeful angle to take as well. And I think people will appreciate kind of hearing that's the culture within Harvey AI, and kind of what you as a company are kind of setting out to do is nice.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I've pondered, over the last few years, and I asked some colleagues and peers in the industry this question, and no one has an answer to it, which is, has ChatGPT and Claude and whatever, the public-facing versions of it, have they been a net gain or loss for access to justice? Because exactly as you said, people use it for different bits and pieces. You don't know, really. You as a non-lawyer, you have basically zero judgment in terms of like if it's telling you the right thing, or
Correct.
Like if you say, I've got this problem, I've been sued, or I want to whatever, or here's a contract, that you basically have absolutely no way of knowing if it's good. Like it will look good, it always does, but in many cases it is good. I mean, if it was always bad, then people would stop using it anyway. But it's like, has the availability of that actually led to better or worse justice? Because there'll be a lot of people who get benefit from it, and there'll be an unknown number of people who think they're getting benefit, but actually had been better off not using it in the first place. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
But we are engaging with lots of, let's say, legal clinics and like pro bono teams to use Harvey, because they are, ultimately, like the point is, if you are a lawyer that can exercise their judgment and use Harvey to, let's say, service your legal aid clients, or like pro bono is where you are a private practice lawyer, let's say a big law firm, or any law firm, but like the big law firms do a lot of this. And you are, let's say, a corporate lawyer, but you will do some pro bono, like free legal work on housing or immigration or whatever, just because you are giving back to the community. Can Harvey help you do that bit better? But you've got some level of legal judgment to exercise there, and you can remain in control and be critical with your lawyer hat on. I think that's probably a better place for legal AI companies.
Yeah. So, but before we end off, just a little bit on the tech side, and I don't know how much kind of you are allowed to say, but in terms of the underlying models, are you partnered? Are you still partnered with OpenAI?
So we actually have a multi-model approach. Not all of our competitors do this, but we are. So we've got partnerships with OpenAI, with Anthropic, with Google, with Mistral, and you. I think is that definitely those four, and we have hundreds and hundreds of knowledge sources, like external other sources, to like augment the. You can, let's say you're like got a question about Algeria, something, in that particular jurisdiction, you can like click that button and it will enable some other knowledge sources that are relevant.
Got
But
it.
from a
Okay.
perspective, yeah, definitely multimodal. But one of the main USPs of Harvey is the Harvey engine itself, which, like, when you prompt something in Harvey, it will run like dozens and dozens of other prompts behind the scenes, each using we would classify to be the right model for that task, to come up with the most accurate, most well thought through answer from a legal perspective. So what we don't do is just, let's say, you click like you can either use the Harvey engine or let's say use the Harvey engine. What it doesn't do is like just use the latest Claude model and just do a one-shot prompt to give you the answer. That would be a very thin product. It's a lot more sophisticated than that, particularly when you come up to look at our long horizon agents that can kind of work autonomously for hours, and like really iterate, hundreds, thousands of times on a long task. So, that involves multiple steps, lots of integrations, lots of interactions with different, people and systems. Like, that is multi-model. That is, that's like, and that's already live in the system, but yeah, fully agentic.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing where I find the LLMs get really interesting. So from a developer's perspective, it's what can they do together? Like you're saying, if you're running prompts through different models which specialize in different areas in order to like get to the final output, that's where if we were coming on as a tech team to look at a product which, like it has to be more than a thin layer, because if it is just a thin layer, well, then they'll just go to the original models themselves, because you're just kind of an interface for an existing model. And that's where things get interesting in terms of what you can do behind the scenes from the input of the user to the output. Do you hit a lot of issues with privacy? Like, are people able to self-host models, or how does that work?
I'm not sure about self-hosting. We are training our own model, which is good. We actually have an AI research team, and have done since the company was founded, pretty much. Certainly at least for the last 3 years, to look at, for example, we've open sourced a few benchmarks. So the performance of models on discrete legal tasks, and we score them consistently. And we've open sourced that so people can test on that or test on their own stuff. But actually, in a world where, you've got some firms looking at consumption-based pricing because agents consume so many more tokens, I think there is a path to at least mitigating that with, let's say, a model that we've trained, and then we can prove that it's like, let's say, similar level frontier quality for legal tasks. Or potentially allowing clients to train their own stuff in the system, TBC on that, I suppose. Or, open source models, or just like harnessing the cheaper models in a way which, again, we can demonstrate, again, reaches like near frontier level quality, and having that as a system that underpins some of these agents. And again, like, a lot of it is in not just whether it's possible or whether it's good, but whether you can show that it's good, because people might always say, we'll just use the best model. But actually, if you can have the same result at a fraction of the cost and energy usage and time taken, like, why don't you do that? But
that's so, go on. Sorry, go on.
Client, like, you have to, like, I ask to our clients, but also, let's say, the innovation directors at our clients, to their own lawyers, to say, this is not on the latest model, but it's got the same level of quality, and we can show you that that's true. For me, that's the big thing. So, like, this is more of a longer term play, that our applied research team is looking into. But I think it's really important to have that capability, and I'm proud that we do that, because I think, as we move into systems that create that consume, unlimited levels more potent, you have to have a better answer than just like deploy GPT 5.6. Do you know what I mean?
That's so amazing. I can't even tell you how comforting and amazing that is to hear. And I think people who don't necessarily have a deep technical understanding should take comfort in what you've just said there, because there's a lot of concern at the moment. We know that the big tech giants are subsidizing the cost of tokens. And so I do think at some point in the future, there's going to be a big space for kind of, like you're saying, open source models, things that you could either host yourself. It keeps your data a lot more private, and it kind of keeps those costs down. I think that will become a really interesting space. And like you said, depending on the quality of those open source models and how good they get. But it's amazing to hear kind of you've got a research team who are staying on top of that sort of stuff. We're coming up to the end. Before we finish, if people have listened to this, either they work in the legal industry or they're interested in what you're doing, what's the best way they can get hold of you?
Me, LinkedIn. I think I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So just look me up, send me a message. And, we at Harvey are hiring at a very high clip. So our valuation is 11 billion. And, we've fundraised quite a lot to be able to scale. So, opening lots of new offices all across the globe. We just had our first quarter where we added 100 million in ARR, just all in the last quarter. So amazing time to be in the industry, amazing time to be at Harvey, hiring lots of roles. So, they're all on the website. Anything specific for anything I've just spoken about, just hit me up on LinkedIn, I think.
Nice. Okay, great. So you can find notes and a complete transcript for this episode at giantrobots.fm. If you have questions or comments, you can email us at hosts@giantrobots.fm. This podcast is brought to you by thoughtbot. We are the wonderful consultants. If you have any AI needs, or you need bespoke software, or just an audit on your current code base, please feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.